Hello, my name's Pete. I'm the Aussie Bush Cop. In 2012 I retired from the New South Wales Police and moved to beautiful King Island, where I became a homesteader. And I'd like to share with you some of my stories of crime and criminals from the New South Wales bush. G'day everybody, thanks so much for joining me again. I have a few more stories for you, and one of them has to do with a house that we used to go to quite routinely. And as we've mentioned numerous times before, police have their frequent flyers, and this was one of those. But this was a particularly sad sort of situation where there was some young children living with a mother, and the mother had particular psychological issues where she used to make herself sick. I'm not sure what the technical term for that is, but she used to make herself sick, and then that would necessitate our attendance. Now you might think, well, why on earth would police be attending someone because they're sick? Well, it's one of those general things is that police can get called to almost anything. People running out of electricity. I've been called to a house because their power went off during the night. So it's not something that's completely unusual. So this house I went to, and as I said, there were some young children living there, and I had genuine concerns for their welfare. And when I got called there this particular day, the mother was not there, and so those young kids were there, and I said to this young girl, if you needed to ring the police, do you know how to do that? And she said, oh yes, I ring 000, which is all fine and good. And I said to her, can you show me where your phone is? Back in the day before, well, there was mobile phones around, but they're certainly not as common as they are now. And so she took me inside and showed me where the phone was. And so I was satisfied that that was the case, that she knew where the phone was and she knew how to use it. Later on that day, this was during a day shift, and I was called into the superintendent's office, and that's the commander's office, because the mother had come home and the daughter had said to the mother, oh, the policeman was here before and he came into the house and wanted to look at the phone, or came into the house. And so she made a formal complaint that I'd broke into her house, which just wasn't the case. I was in there by an invitation, and beyond that, I was there for legal reasons, which was to make sure that the little girl was being cared for, or at least had the ability to be cared for. And so the superintendent spoke to me, and he was more than satisfied that what I'd done was absolutely appropriate, and gave me a well done. But it's one of the difficulties that you have to try and do the right thing, and not become too embroiled in other issues. One of the other stories that I have for you is when I was joining the New South Wales Police, and there's all these different checks that go on, and there's sometimes there are people that aren't very happy about you joining the police, and one of them was, I won't say who it was, but someone that I'd had an issue with in the town where I lived, and they were not, you wouldn't say they were friendly towards me. And so at the time my job was driving a garbage truck. I don't know how heavy it was, but I generally referred to it as a 20-tonne garbage truck. But you know the sort of thing, it was a two-man operation. And I spent half my life running behind this garbage truck, which, by the way, made me very, very fit and strong for joining the police. Anyway, one day, half the time I was driving the truck and the other half running behind it. Anyway, on this particular shift, a policeman arrived and spoke to us, and he was a sergeant of police at Wellington Police Station, where I used to do these garbage truck duties. And apart from just picking up garbage bins on the side of the road, we also had industrial bins to pick up. And that meant we drove into business houses, and usually it was in behind the business house. You're going in through reasonably confined spaces, like narrow driveways. But after you'd done it a few times, you're an expert at doing it. You knew where the truck was, and you knew where to turn, and the truck had a reversing camera on it, So it was all very, very stock standard. And this particular business house that I'd driven into that morning, I noticed when I drove in, between the fence and, say, the building, there was a car parked there, and the driver's side of the car had been quite heavily damaged by something colliding with it, another vehicle. And I just remembered seeing that. Anyway, during the shift, this policeman showed up and he said, "Mate, I've had a complaint that you backed into someone's car." Now, the person who owned the car was actually an employee at that business house, and he started work reasonably early. And he said that you've reversed into his car, and I knew that wasn't the case. And I said to the sergeant, the sergeant wasn't being nasty or horrible towards us, so I said, "You go and measure the back of my truck, and then you go and measure the damage on that car, and I'll guarantee you it doesn't correspond." And so he did that. I mean, he didn't need my suggestion to do that. He was a very experienced policeman. And he concluded very quickly that just wasn't the case. And I think what was behind it was that the person who drove the car was offside with me about another issue. And he was trying to hinder my ability to join the police. And that's a pretty nasty thing to do. And beyond that, I said to the sergeant, there's no way in the world he got into that car this morning and didn't see the damage to the car. I said he knew that was there. And so, I mean, very quickly that matter was dismissed. But it just shows how nasty people can be when it comes to, trying to be nasty. And so it was probably a pretty good, what would you say, precursor to what it was like being in the cops, because people complain about anything and everything. The other thing that I'll share with you today is sometimes being in the police, you've got to be a little bit flexible in the way that you apply the law. And this particular night, when this job happened, I was called out of bed in the middle of the night. I was at one of my one-man stations because there was someone trespassing at a local swimming pool. So I, put on my uniform, drove over there to this other town. It wasn't the town where I was stationed. And sure enough, in the pool, you can hear frolicking, and when they saw the police truck pull up, they attempted to hide. So I saw what it was a male and a female, young male and a young female in the pool, and who cares really? It was a hot night, and they jumped the fence, or they actually cut the fence, or someone had cut the fence, and went in through the wire. So, I mean, I couldn't just leave them there. So I said to this fellow that I could see clearly, I had my big, powerful mag light torch, and I shone it on him and said, "Mate, get out of here." So he came out, and then the girl was trying to hide, and she wasn't very good at hiding. So I shone the torch on her and told her to come out as well. So I got their names and their addresses, and I didn't want to take up too much time on the night, so I went and saw them the next day. And they both worked at the same place in this little town the next day. And I went and saw them, and the female was actually a backpacker from somewhere, I forget now, but somewhere in the Northern Hemisphere. And I wasn't really all that sure how much trouble she would get into if she got in it, because I could deal with this by way of an infringement notice. And and the infringement notice was surprisingly expensive. I think it was around $500 for entering enclosed lands. And so I didn't really want to, I thought that was a pretty heavy fine, and I really didn't want to impact on her ability to return to the country if she had that action taken against her. So what I did, I sat them both down, and I said, "Listen, I'm going to issue just one infringement notice, and it's going to be to you," meaning the male, and he was an Australian resident. I said, "You're going to get the fine, but you're going to go halves in it." And so who knows what happened, but they paid the fine, and her ability to come into the country and leave the country were not hindered. Anyway, that's one of the ways that I thought was the best way to deal with it. There was another story is about when I worked in Dubbo. As you might know, Dubbo was a pretty wild town, and as far as I know, it still is. and we were going to a job in the really bad part of town, and but on the way to this job, whatever it was, might have been a break and enter, for example, but my partner and I came across a fight happening between two females, and there was a large crowd of people that had encircled the two females, and one was fighting the other. One was an older female, probably about 50 years old, and the one that was doing the attacking was much, much younger, probably only in her 20s. So we immediately, and the crowd was just stirring this pair up to, even to greater violence. It was just a horrible situation. So the one that was doing the attacking, I took hold of her by the scruff of the neck, and I just put her on the backside, and we called for urgent assistance, because what happens in situations like that is very quickly the crowd can then turn against us, because then we become the common enemy. And so we called for urgent assistance, and so we had our. I remember having my baton out, telling people to back off, and it was pretty tense. The girl that I was working with on that particular shift was a fairly new probationary constable, and she did an excellent job in holding back the crowd. Anyway, the other police arrived, and I'm not sure why, but I didn't take the female that had been doing the assaulting into custody on that particular occasion. There must have been a good reason for that. But I do remember getting a statement from the older female, and that would have been the reason. I got a statement from the other female, and I was satisfied that she was the victim and the other one was the perpetrator, based on what she said and based on what I witnessed. So the next morning, I was on day shift the next day. The next morning, I went back and I took the female into custody. And I remember when I arrived at her home, it was a much more peaceful situation the next morning, and her husband came to the door, told him who I was looking for, and he said, "I suppose you've come to apologise." And I said, "Not likely." So they took the female into custody without any problems. She was very compliant. Took her into custody, took her back to the police station, charged her with 1 count of common assault, put her on some sort of bail, and that was the end of the matter. One of those days when I was just out patrolling, and I came across, in a very rural area, I came across huge burnout marks out the front of someone's, out the front of a property, a farm property. And so I drove into the farm. It was up probably about 100 or 200 metres up the road and up the driveway, and come to the farmhouse, and there was a young man, meaning probably in his 20s, and he was there, and he told me nothing about what had occurred. He claimed to know nothing about it, but there was other evidence, maybe the tyres on his car, certainly made me, I concluded that he was the offender that had done this out on the road. I took notice that he had signs in right at the back of his house. Was either 2 or 3 street signs from the local town, like street signs like Smith Street, Jones Street, which is an offence. You can't have those. He clearly didn't. They weren't his, and he'd stolen them. So I then went across the road. There was another farmhouse almost directly across the road where an elderly woman lived, and she seemed to be there on her own. But she was still operating the place as a farm, and I asked her, said, "Ma'am, did you witness anything across the road?" And she told me yes, she did. But she wasn't willing to make a formal statement about that, fearing repercussions. And she said he could set fire to my wheat crop, and we're talking about a wheat crop could be worth tens of thousands of dollars. So I then came across or spoke to this young man's father. And he was on side with me, because I said to the father, "Would you be okay if I tell your son off big time?" And he said, "Mate, I'd be really glad if you could do that, because he's having problems with his son, controlling his son." So anyway, I did that, and so I then went back because the father lived at another site. So I went back to the first house where the young man lived and the burnout marks out on the road. And so I tore strips off this young man, and then I told him that these signs that he had in his place, these street signs, this was on a weekend. I said, you are going to return those to the Orange City Council. So you were going to go to their depot, and you were going to return these signs to the Orange City Depot. And if you don't, I will be charging you with an offence for having those in your custody. And I said, I'm going to put an intelligence report that's going to be attached to your car. And none of that was bluff. I meant that. And I said, every time a highway patrol car goes past your car, their computer is going to see your registration, and they're going to know that you're a possible suspect for committing these offences. And they'll stop you, they'll check the tyres on your car, including your spare tyre, and so that was to curb his misbehaviour. And I never ever come across him again, and I'm sure that had the desired effect. So it's just an example of sometimes you need to be flexible in the way that you approach these matters when you can't prove it, but you pretty much know who it is that did it. Bring them to account. Anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.